I am Keturah. And before my name was ever whispered in the tents of Abraham, I was a woman who had learned to listen, to silence, to wind, to God. The desert was my teacher. Its quiet stretched farther than sight, and its winds carried more truth than the words of men. I lived among a small tribe east of Canaan, where our tents moved with the seasons, and our wells were our treasures. That I had heard stories of Abraham, the man whose God spoke from the heavens, who left his father's house because of a voice unseen. Some called him the friend of God. Others called him a dreamer. That I never imagined that our paths would cross. At that time, I was a widow. My husband had died of fever during the journey to new grazing lands. I had buried my grief beneath my veil, and each day I drew water for the flocks, pretending I had forgotten what it meant to love and be loved. But God remembers even the quiet ones. Far to the west, in Hebron, Abraham sat alone in the tent that once belonged to Sarah. The great mother of nations had died, and though Abraham's faith was strong, his heart had grown silent. His laughter, the laughter that once named his son Isaac, had faded into the sands. That it was then, I believe, that heaven began weaving our stories together. For just as Abraham mourned in Hebron, I began to dream of a man whose eyes carried both fire and peace. And in those dreams, a voice whispered my name, Keturah. It meant fragrance of incense. Perhaps God meant to tell me my life was not over, that my fragrance was still needed in another man's story. I did not meet Abraham suddenly. Our meeting was written slowly, like sunlight spreading over the sand. In Hebron, the great man of faith spent his evenings sitting before the fading light, his eyes tracing the memories of his long journey. He had walked with kings, built altars, buried his beloved, and now, he waited. The servant said he spoke little after Sarah's burial. His son Isaac had gone to dwell near Beer-lahai-roi, and Abraham's camp, once filled with laughter, had grown still. The sound of the flocks could be heard again, but not the voice of Sarah, not the music of her laughter. Sometimes, I wonder if loneliness is the last test of the righteous, for Abraham, who had once believed for a son in his 100th year, must now believe that life could still hold beauty after loss. God had promised him nations. But nations do not spring from memories, they spring from life, and though Abraham was old, the promise still breathed. One night, while I sat outside my tent watching the stars, a group of travelers passed near our camp. They were messengers, carrying word from Abraham's household, seeking water and rest. That I welcomed them, offering dates and drink as custom demanded, but as one of them thanked me, he paused, his gaze softened. "You remind me," he said quietly, "of peace that once filled my master's tent." I smiled politely, not understanding. But those words stayed with me. That night, I dreamed again, the same dream, the same voice calling me, Keturah. And this time, I saw a man seated under a tamarisk tree, his face old but shining like the sun after rain. I knew then, my journey was not yet complete. The messengers left before dawn. Their shadows faded into the distance as the first blush of morning kissed the dunes. I watched them disappear, not knowing that my name now traveled with them, for among them was one who had been moved by my kindness, the same man who had whispered of peace and remembrance. When they reached Hebron, he spoke of me to Abraham, saying, "My lord, in our journey east, we met a woman whose gentleness reminded me of the fragrance of incense. Her name is Keturah." And though the old patriarch said nothing at first, something in his spirit stirred. Perhaps he remembered how God had never stopped fulfilling his promises, even in impossible seasons, for Abraham knew well that when heaven names a woman fragrance, she is not sent to be hidden in the wilderness. That evening, Abraham asked quietly, "Where does she dwell?" And when he was told, he nodded, as if recognizing a plan that was not his own. Days later, as I poured water at the well, I saw strangers approaching again, this time carrying gifts. They were servants of Abraham. They spoke with honor, their words measured, their purpose clear. "Our master Abraham desires to meet you." For a moment, I could not breathe. I had heard his name all my life, Abraham, the father of faith, the man who had spoken with God as with a friend. Why would such a man seek me, a widow, a wanderer of the desert? Yet deep inside, I felt a quiet assurance, like the scent of incense rising after flame. I knew this was not the work of men. It was the movement of a promise. I gathered my things with trembling hands. And as the caravan set out toward Hebron, I looked once more at the land of my tribe, the sand, the stones, the sky, and whispered, God of Abraham, if you have called me, I will go. The journey to Hebron was long and silent. The hooves of the camel struck the earth with a rhythm that felt like the beating of my own heart, steady, uncertain, alive. As we approached the hills, I could see the tents of Abraham rising in the distance like small white sails against the golden land. The scent of sheep and firewood filled the air. It was not a palace, yet there was something holy about it. The air itself seemed to breathe stories of promise and prayer. When we arrived, the servants welcomed me with kindness, guiding me through the camp until we reached the largest tent. And there he was, Abraham, the man I had heard of since childhood, the man who had walked with the unseen God. That he stood tall for his age, his beard silver as moonlight, his eyes calm but searching. I expected the sternness of an elder, but instead I saw warmth, a quiet peace that seemed to recognize me even before I spoke. Peace to you, he said softly. And though the desert wind stirred between us, I felt no distance. Peace to you, my lord, I replied, bowing my head. That he studied me for a moment, then smiled, as though finding something long lost. They told me your name means fragrance. Yes, I answered. It was given to me when I was born. He nodded slowly. I lost my Sarah, he said, but God did not take away my breath. He gives again what the heart thought it would never hold. His words were simple, yet they sank deep into me. For I too had known loss, and now I stood before a man who had carried his pain with faith, not bitterness. That evening, we spoke for a long time, about the ways of God, the journeys of the soul, the ache of love that time cannot erase. And as stars began to bloom above the tent, I realized that the desert of my life had found its rain. The days that followed were quiet and tender, like dawn spreading without hurry. I remained in Abraham's camp as a guest, yet his kindness made me feel as though I had already come home. That he would walk with me among the flocks at sunrise, speaking little. Sometimes he told me stories of places he had seen, Egypt, Gerar, the oak of Mamre, and of the voice that had called him out of his father's land. That he never spoke of himself as great, he only said, the Lord led me, and I followed. When he laughed, it was soft and rare, but it carried warmth enough to chase the chill of evening. There was wisdom in him that felt older than sand, yet humility that made even the smallest servant feel seen. One afternoon, we sat beneath a tamarisk tree. The wind carried the smell of roasting grain, and the sunlight broke through the leaves in golden patterns. I asked, does faith ever grow weary? He smiled. It bends, he said, but does not break when it is rooted in God. Even an old tree can still bear fruit if the river runs near. His answer stayed with me. For though he was near the end of his years, I saw no ending in him, only beginnings written in quiet places. And slowly, without either of us naming it, companionship blossomed into love. It was not the fiery passion of youth but the steady warmth of two hearts healed by grace. We spoke often of Sarah, and never did I feel jealousy. Her memory rested between us like incense before an altar, sweet, lingering, accepted. I began to tend the household, not as a servant but as one who belonged. The servants smiled when they passed, and the camp, once hushed by grief, began to hum again with life. I realized then that sometimes God writes new songs for hearts that thought they would never sing again. The night before Abraham asked me to become his wife, the desert wind spoke to me again. That it moved softly through the tents, carrying the scent of roasted grain and olive oil. I stepped outside and lifted my eyes to the stars. the same stars Abraham had once counted when God promised him nations. "Peace to you," he said softly. And though the desert wind stirred between us, I felt no distance. "Peace to you, my lord," I replied, bowing my head. That he studied me for a moment, then smiled, as though finding something long lost. "They told me your name means fragrance." "Yes," I answered. "It was given to me when I was born." He nodded slowly. "I lost my Sarah," he said, "but God did not take away my breath. He gives again what the heart thought it would never hold." His words were simple, yet they sank deep into me. For I too had known loss, and now I stood before a man who had carried his pain with faith, not bitterness. That evening, we spoke for a long time, about the ways of God, the journeys of the soul, the ache of love that time cannot erase. And as stars began to bloom above the tent, I realized that the desert of my life had found its rain. The days that followed were quiet and tender, like dawn spreading without hurry. I remained in Abraham's camp as a guest, yet his kindness made me feel as though I had already come home. That he would walk with me among the flocks at sunrise, speaking little. Sometimes he told me stories of places he had seen, Egypt, Gerar, the oak of Mamre, and of the voice that had called him out of his father's land. That he never spoke of himself as great, he only said, "The Lord led me, and I followed." When he laughed, it was soft and rare, but it carried warmth enough to chase the chill of evening. There was wisdom in him that felt older than sand, yet humility that made even the smallest servant feel seen. One afternoon, we sat beneath a tamarisk tree. The wind carried the smell of roasting grain, and the sunlight broke through the leaves in golden patterns. I asked, "Does faith ever grow weary?" He smiled. "It bends," he said, "but does not break when it is rooted in God. Even an old tree can still bear fruit if the river runs near." His answer stayed with me. For though he was near the end of his years, I saw no ending in him, only beginnings written in quiet places. And slowly, without either of us naming it, companionship blossomed into love. It was not the fiery passion of youth, but the steady warmth of two hearts healed by grace. We spoke often of Sarah, and never did I feel jealousy. Her memory rested between us like incense before an altar, sweet, lingering, accepted. I began to tend the household, not as a servant but as one who belonged. The servants smiled when they passed, and the camp, once hushed by grief, began to hum again with life. I realized then that sometimes God writes new songs for hearts that thought they would never sing again. The night before Abraham asked me to become his wife, the desert wind spoke to me again. That it moved softly through the tents, carrying the scent of roasted grain and olive oil. I stepped outside and lifted my eyes to the stars, the same stars Abraham had once counted when God promised him nations. The same God who remembered Sarah had remembered me. When Abraham finished praying, he looked at me and smiled. "Life," he said, "does not end where sorrow thought it did." And as we stood beneath the morning sun, I knew that love, when written by God's hand, is never too late. The first night I entered Abraham's tent as his wife, I felt a quiet reverence in my spirit. Everything around me whispered of memories, the woven mats that once bore Sarah's footsteps, the old jars of oil, the folded garments that still carried her scent of cedar and myrrh. I did not come to replace her, I came to continue what God had begun. Abraham sat beside the small fire inside, his face calm, his hands resting upon his staff. He spoke little, but when he did, each word felt like a seed planted deep in the soil of my heart. "The Lord," he said softly, "gives different seasons to the same soul." When Sarah lived, laughter was the sound of our faith. With you, Keturah, I feel peace, the silence that follows a promise fulfilled. I listened, my eyes tracing the flames as they danced at that flickering light. I saw not an old man but the friend of God, one who had carried divine mysteries across deserts, one who had learned that obedience is the highest form of worship. And as for me, I, who once thought my story had ended, found myself beginning again. No ceremony, no celebration, only the still assurance that I had been placed exactly where heaven intended. Outside, the night hummed with quiet life, camels shifted. Servants whispered. The stars glimmered as though leaning close to hear. And somewhere between earth and sky, my heart found its rest that I was Keturah, wife of Abraham, witness to the endless faithfulness of God. The seasons turned gently after our union. The flocks multiplied, and the land seemed to exhale with peace. Abraham spent his mornings walking among the herds, and I, in the still hours of dawn, would grind the grain and breathe the cool air that carried the scent of life. Days became months, and one morning, while pouring water from a clay jar, my hand trembled. The world spun softly, and I steadied myself against the tent pole. It was a small thing, yet deep within, I knew something sacred had begun to stir. That evening, as the sun sank low, I told Abraham. He looked at me for a long moment, the same gaze he must have given Sarah when she first spoke of Isaac. Then, slowly, he lifted his hands and laughed, a sound so tender it made the servants pause outside the tent. Again, he whispered. The Lord has remembered his word. I felt warmth fill the tent, as if heaven itself smiled. I was not young, and Abraham was aged beyond measure, yet faith is not bound by time. The God who opens barren wombs and breathes life into dust had visited us again. That night, as I lay beside Abraham, I thought of Sarah, of her laughter, her journey, her faith. I whispered into the silence. Your laughter has become my peace. The promise continues.
The days that followed glowed with purpose. The women of the camp watched me with wonder, and every movement of my body reminded me that I carried not just life, but legacy. I carried nations yet unborn. Time passed like flowing water, calm, steady, and full of hidden songs. My body swelled with life, and every day Abraham's face glowed with quiet awe. He would rest his hand on my stomach and whisper blessings, names, prayers, prophecies, words that seemed to ripple through eternity. When the time came, the camp was filled with movement and light. The midwives gathered, their hands ready, their hearts steady, and there, under the same stars that had witnessed Abraham's covenant with God, I brought forth life. First came Zimran, strong and calm like the morning breeze. Then Jokshan, quick to cry, as though announcing destiny to the heavens. Midian, Ishbak, and Shua followed, 6 sons, each with eyes bright as fire, each carrying a whisper of divine inheritance. Abraham held them one by one, his aged hands trembling with joy. He named them carefully, as if each name was a prayer stitched into eternity. When all the camp had quieted, he turned to me and said, God is not finished with those who still believe. Through you, Keturah, he has proved again that his word does not fade, it multiplies. I looked upon my sons and wept softly. Not for sorrow, but for the wonder of grace. For I knew that though Isaac was the chosen seed of the covenant, my sons too carried a purpose, to fill the earth with nations and to bear witness that Abraham's faith was never in vain. The tents echoed with laughter again, the laughter of children, the laughter of renewal. And as I watched Abraham lift our youngest to the sky in blessing, I whispered, the God who sees has done this, he who remembers the forgotten. The laughter of our sons filled the camp like music carried on the wind. Each morning Abraham would rise before the sun, leaning on his staff, his eyes tracing the horizon as though he could still see promises dancing beyond it. We had learned to live in quiet rhythm, prayer at dawn, the bleating of the flocks, the soft hum of grinding stone, and the gentle talk at night when the fire dimmed. Age did not silence Abraham, it refined him. When he spoke of God, his voice trembled not from weakness, but from wonder. I found peace in tending small things, weaving cloth for our sons, mixing incense, pouring oil into the lamps. Once, I asked him, does the heart ever grow weary of faith? He smiled. No, my Keturah. Faith is the breath between God's promise and its fulfillment. If you stop breathing, you stop living. And I knew, our marriage was not the echo of his past, but the continuation of his purpose. At night, Abraham would sit with our sons near the fire, his voice steady and low. He taught them the ways of the Lord, to fear God, to love justice, to walk humbly. He told them stories of altars built with trembling hands and of angels who had spoken promise.
Beneath the stars, the children listened wide-eyed, and I listened too, though I had heard each story many times. There was power in his remembrance. Every retelling breathed life into ancient faith. One night, when the boys had gone to sleep, I said, "Do you ever miss the journey?" He looked into the flames. "I still journey, Keturah," he answered. "Only now, I walk toward the unseen city whose builder is God." I laid my hand over his, feeling the pulse of his life, slow, steady, unbroken. He had become the living proof that faith does not grow old. One season, Isaac came from Beer Lahai Roi to visit. When he entered the camp, Abraham's eyes filled with tears. Father and son embraced long, their laughter echoing between the hills that I watched from the tent entrance, joy stirring inside me. Isaac's presence filled the air with remembrance, of Sarah, of the journey, of every test that had shaped their faith. Later, Isaac came to me. "My father has peace again," he said. "For many years I feared grief would swallow him. You have brought back his laughter." I bowed my head, humbled. "It was not I," I replied. "It was the God who never stops giving new beginnings." Before Isaac left, Abraham blessed him again, and the two prayed together under the stars. I stood afar and whispered my own prayer, "May our sons know the same covenant, and may peace never depart from this tent." Years flowed softly after Isaac's visit. Abraham's steps grew slower, yet his spirit remained bright. We would walk together at dusk, and I would carry a small jar of incense, my name's meaning living in my hands. One evening, as the sky blazed with red and gold, he said, "Keturah, do you know why God gave you that name?" I smiled. "Because he delights in fragrance?" He shook his head gently. "Because incense rises when it burns. Your faith rose from the ashes of sorrow. That is why God sent you to me." I held those words close. Every act of love became worship, preparing his meals, binding his sandals, sitting beside him while he rested. In serving him, I served the God who joined our stories. One cool night, Abraham called for me to walk with him beyond the tents. The air was crisp, and the sky stretched endless above us, jeweled with stars. That he pointed upward and said, "When I first counted these, I did not know how the promise would come. I only believed. Now I see them, and I remember every mercy along the way, Sarah, Isaac, you, and our sons. God has been faithful through every breath." I looked at the stars and saw reflections of our lives, distant lights burning through darkness. We stood in silence, and I felt the wind brush my veil, as though heaven itself blessed us one last time together. When we returned to the tent, he whispered, "If I sleep and do not wake, remember, the covenant still lives. Tell our sons that faith is stronger than time." I held his hand, and for a moment, the whole desert felt like an altar, still, sacred, eternal. The morning after that night of stars was calm. The camp stirred slowly, the sound of camels, the rustle of tents, the fragrance of bread baking. But Abraham did not rise. That I found him lying peacefully, his face turned toward the east as though watching the sunrise. There was no fear in his stillness, no struggle in his rest, only peace, like one who had finally reached home. That I knelt beside him, touching his hand. It was warm with memory, the same hand that had built altars, lifted suns, and held mine through many seasons. Tears slipped down my face, but my heart did not break, for I knew this was not the end. It was the fulfillment of every promise. I whispered, "Sleep well, my beloved. You have walked with God, and now you walk into his presence." Outside, Our sons played in the sand, their laughter rising into the morning light, a living echo of his faith. Word spread swiftly, and our sons came together. Isaac arrived first, followed by the 6 sons of my womb. They stood before me, tall and strong, the legacy of a man who believed when the world doubted. Isaac embraced me with silent gratitude. Together we laid Abraham to rest beside Sarah in the cave of Machpelah, just as he had wished. No wailing filled the air, only solemn songs and the scent of incense. When the last stone was set, Isaac spoke softly, "He has joined our mother in the place of peace." And I answered, "And his faith lives in us." Later, as the sons gathered in the evening, I told them all that their father had said, his blessing, his counsel, his charge to walk before God blameless. They listened, heads bowed, the firelight dancing across their faces. And in that moment, I saw Abraham's spirit resting in each of them. After the morning days, Isaac lingered to speak with me. Abraham had left Isaac everything of the covenant, the blessing, the promise, the inheritance of Canaan, but to the sons I bore, he had given gifts, camels, gold, spices, and land to dwell in the east. Isaac honored his father's word. Before he departed, he embraced each brother, blessing them with peace. There was no envy, no anger, only quiet understanding. As they prepared their caravans, I watched each son take a final look at the camp. Their journeys would carry them far, to Arabia, to Midian, to the deserts beyond the Red Sea. Yet in every step they would carry Abraham's faith, hidden in their hearts like seeds waiting for rain. When the last of them disappeared into the horizon, I whispered, "Go with God, my sons. Be living incense in every land." The camp grew quiet after they left. The wind moved through the empty tents like a whisper of memory. I spent my days weaving cloth, tending small fires, and walking the same paths Abraham once walked. At night, I would sit outside and talk softly to God. The same God who saw me when I was unseen, who gave me joy after loneliness, who filled my life with meaning when I thought it was over. I thought of Sarah often, though we had never met. Sometimes I felt her near, 2 women joined not by rivalry, but by purpose. We had both been chosen to carry fragments of a covenant greater than ourselves. And I realized then, love in old age is not about youth regained. It is about purpose renewed, about 2 souls finding rest in the will of God. As the years passed, I became known among the tribes as the woman of incense, the fragrance that lingered after faith had finished its course. People would come to my tent seeking wisdom. I told them not of my beauty or my sorrow, but of the God who multiplies beginnings even in old age. I said to them, Abraham's faith did not end with him. It flows like unseen perfume across generations, and every time you choose to believe when it makes no sense, that is the scent of faith. On my final evening, the wind carried the smell of incense from the altar outside my tent. I smiled, knowing the same God who called Abraham had written my story into his great design. My eyes closed softly as the world faded into gold. And in that last breath, I heard a whisper. Your life was a fragrance, Keturah. Well done. The years after Abraham's passing unfolded like ripples on still water. I watched the desert change colors each season, amber in harvest, silver in dawn. Yet what changed most was the space between my tents, now wide with memory. My sons had gone eastward, following the paths their father once walked in faith. From time to time, messengers came, riders carrying spices, letters, and news wrapped in linen. They told of Zimran, who settled near the red cliffs beyond Midian, trading copper and cloth. Jokshan, ever restless, had built encampments among caravans that crossed toward Sheba. Midian tended flocks near the wadis, where the palms trembled in wind. Midian, the wise one, built wells and altars, teaching travelers to fear the unseen God. Ishbak moved beyond the dunes of the east, and Shua made his tents by the great river. Each story was like a grain of incense dropped into the fire of remembrance, brief, fragrant, vanishing upward toward the sky. And I, their mother, prayed that every breath they took would still carry the name of Abraham's God. One evening a messenger arrived with a parchment sealed in wax. The mark belonged to Zimran. I broke it open carefully, and his words leapt like the laughter of youth. Mother, the desert has become my classroom, the men here worship many gods, but I tell them of the one who called my father. When the sun sets, I build an altar and lift my voice to heaven. They call me the son of faith, that I tell them I am the son of Abraham, and of Keturah, whose prayers smell of incense. I pressed the parchment to my heart. The wind carried the faint scent of myrrh, and I whispered, "May your worship rise higher than the sandstorms, my son." That night, I slept with peace woven into my dreams. Seasons later, the sound of camels announced visitors. When I stepped outside, I saw Midian, my fourth son, tall and steady, leading his caravan through the dust. Behind him came his wife and children, their faces bright with desert sun. He embraced me long. "Mother," he said, "I have come to thank you. You taught us to serve God even when no altar stands before us." That night we feasted. He spoke of wells he had dug, of strangers he had fed, of a tribe forming around faith rather than blood. "Many laugh at me," he admitted, "but some kneel beside my altar. They call him El Shaddai now." I looked into his eyes, the same quiet flame I had seen in Abraham's. "Then you are your father's son," I said. "And the covenant breathes through your hands." That same night, after Midian slept, I dreamed. The sky opened above me and 7 stars appeared, bright as polished bronze. 6 of them moved eastward, forming rivers of light. The 7th hovered above, pouring fragrance upon the earth. A voice whispered, "These are the sons of your womb. Their paths shall cover nations, and their altars shall carry your name sent." I woke with the fragrance of incense still in the air. Kneeling on the desert floor, I lifted my hands and said, "Lord of Abraham, let their journeys be worship, and their nations be peace." The dream stayed with me until my hair turned silver. Whenever I heard tidings from the east, I remembered those 7 stars and knew none would fall unnoticed before God. Years later, caravans from Sheba brought rare spices to my camp. Among their wares I found a carved box wrapped in linen. Inside was a letter and a handful of frankincense. Jokshan wrote, "Mother, I trade in Sheba now. The kings of the south love my incense, but they ask what spirit gives it strength. I tell them it is the God of my father Abraham, who breathes through the deserts and blesses those who believe. Many kneel before my stall to hear of this unseen Lord. The fragrance sells fast, but the faith spreads faster." I laughed softly, tears in my eyes. Even from the markets of Sheba, my son was turning commerce into covenant. The world may forget our names, but it cannot forget the scent of our worship. It was in the season when the acacia trees bloomed pale gold that a rider came from the north, bearing gifts of wool and salt. He knelt before me and said, "I come from Medan, son of Abraham." My heart leaped. He unrolled a scroll and read aloud, "Mother, the land is wide and wild, yet I have found favor among strangers. The people once bowed to carved stones, but now they lift their faces to the heavens when I speak of the God who sees. I have built altars where none stood before, and travelers stopped to pray. I have named each well after the mercies of God, for he is the water of the wilderness." As the messenger spoke, I closed my eyes. I could almost hear the sound of water dripping from rocks, the echo of prayers rising through the heat. When he finished, I said softly, "Tell my son that his mother prays beside every well he digs, even from afar." Years passed, and age rested gently on my shoulders. One evening, a wandering minstrel came through our camp. He sang of a man named Ishbak, who lived beyond the dunes, known for his songs of the one true God. "He sings by the rivers," the minstrel said, "and the people gather. He tells them of Abraham, the friend of God. and of a woman whose name means incense, whose prayers fill the winds with sweetness. My breath caught. Even far away, Ishbak had turned my name into a story, not for my glory, but for the God who remembered the forgotten. When the song ended, I gave the minstrel bread and oil. Tell Ishbak, I said, that every note he sings is a prayer I have already prayed. It was said that Shua, my youngest, had settled near the great river. There he learned to read the flow of water, to plant gardens, to teach wisdom. Strangers came to him seeking counsel, for he judged with fairness and spoke little but true. One merchant who had traveled that way came to my tent that he said, "Your son sits beneath a tree, and men call him the sage of the river. He speaks of the God of his father Abraham, the unseen one who makes life flow like water." I smiled at that, for Shua had always been quiet, even as a child, that he would sit beside me in silence, watching the smoke rise from my incense bowl. Now he watched the rivers, carrying that same silence into nations, that I looked toward the east and whispered, "Every stream remembers its source." In my later years, the desert surprised me once more. One by one, my sons returned. Zimran came first, with silver in his beard and laughter still in his eyes. Jokshan brought gifts from Sheba, gold dust and myrrh. Midian arrived with his children, strong and tall. Medan, Ishbak, and Shua followed, each bringing stories of the lands they ruled. For 7 nights we feasted. The tents glowed like lamps upon the sand. My sons knelt before me, and I blessed them, one by one, calling them by name. When the youngest rose, I said, "Your father's faith was a river. You are the streams that flow from it. Wherever you go, let justice, mercy, and truth be your fragrance." They answered, "We will remember, Mother. Always." And I, old and full of days, felt the desert itself rejoice. Now, as I speak these final words, my hair is white as the sand at dawn. The sons of my womb have become tribes and nations. Their tents stretch across deserts and valleys, and their children carry names that echo Abraham's. Some will forget me in their scrolls, but heaven remembers, for every prayer I whispered still burns like incense before God's throne. That I have learned that legacy is not carved in stone or gold, it is breathed into hearts. Mine was the honor of loving a man who walked with God, and of bearing sons who would spread the fragrance of faith beyond the edge of sight. That as I close my eyes, I see 7 stars once more, bright, unending, and alive. And I hear Abraham's voice in the wind. Faith is the breath between promise and fulfillment. I smile, and whisper back, and I am the fragrance that lingers after. The mornings have grown softer now. When I rise, the desert air feels like memory, warm yet fleeting. My hands tremble as I pour water from the jar, but my heart is steady. The world is quieter, as if it waits. Each day I sit by the doorway of my tent, watching the horizon. The sands shimmer like gold dust, and sometimes I think I see Abraham walking there. His figure outlined by the rising sun, patient and smiling. That I whisper his name. The wind carries it away, gentle as a sigh, and I realize that soon, I will follow. There is no fear, only a deep peace. For I have lived, loved, and prayed enough for 1,000 lifetimes. Sometimes, when the camp is still, I hear laughter in the wind. The laughter of my sons as children, running through the sand dunes. Their small footprints long vanished, yet I can still trace them in my heart. I remember Midian's bold questions, Zimran's jokes, and Shua's gentle wisdom. I remember Abraham's voice reading the names of God to me. And how his hands trembled when he blessed our sons. That so many years have passed, yet those moments shine brighter than the stars. They live within me, as if time itself bows to love. I lift my hands and whisper, "Thank you, Lord, for every breath, every child, every dawn that found me faithful." One evening, a shepherd boy came running with news. Mother of nations, he called me. Travelers from the east say your son's children have built cities by the rivers. Cities, from my tent to cities, from my womb to generations beyond number. I smiled through my tears, for I remembered Abraham's words, God's promise will live beyond our eyes. And now I see it, every sunrise, every caravan, every prayer whispered in the wilderness, all of it is the promise unfolding. Faith, like a seed, has bloomed across the sands. I have always loved the scent of incense, even now, I burn it softly at twilight, watching the smoke rise like a prayer. It twirls upward, curling into the fading light, vanishing, yet never truly gone. That is how I see my life, that I am the smoke that lingers in the memory of faith, a fragrance carried by generations who will never know my name, but will breathe my prayers when they whisper to the same God that I press my hand to my chest and whisper, let every breath I leave behind smell of obedience and peace. Night has fallen. The stars have returned, 7 of them brighter than the rest. I know their meaning now, they are my sons, shining in their places, watching, guiding, enduring that I lie back on my mat, my breath soft, my heart steady, the tent walls blur, and the desert becomes light, somewhere beyond sight, Abraham waits. And beyond him, the one who promised. I smile, the earth has been kind. The heavens kinder still that I was Keturah, wife, mother, servant of the Most High, and though the world may forget my name, the fragrance of my faith will never fade. And so, Keturah's story comes to a close. A woman often forgotten in history, yet remembered in heaven. Her life teaches us that even when the world overlooks your name, God never forgets your fragrance. Every prayer whispered in faith becomes a seed that outlives you. If Keturah's story touched your heart today, take a moment to pause and thank God for every unseen act of obedience in your own life, because faith, true faith, always leaves a fragrance behind. My friend, if you love stories like this, stories of faith, courage, and women whose voices shaped history, please like this video, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next powerful Bible story coming soon. And remember, every view, every comment, every share helps this growing channel reach more hearts with the truth of God's Word. Until next time, keep walking in faith, and let your life be a fragrance that lingers long after you're gone.